Hello, everybody. Good evening. I'm actually a stand-in for the real guy who was supposed to be here tonight, but I'm happy to be here. And my talk today was about if you want to be a bear, if you're going to be a bear, be a grizzly. And I want to just tell you a little bit my story and how I got to that idea. I went to medical school in upstate New York, and I was troubled that first year of medical school. And I was so troubled by medical school that I thought I was going to quit and be a forest ranger, and I'm a tree hugger. But I met a group of friends. I was troubled because I thought being a doctor would be kind of simple. You know, just take care of patients, then you go home at night, have a nice meal, go to sleep, get up and take care of patients. But I understood there were things going on in our world that made medical care not accessible to everyone. And as a first-year medical student, that really disturbed me. And I said, I'm just going to go to the deep woods. But I met a group of like-minded medical students. We studied the U.S. healthcare system. And as a first-year medical student, I knew what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a doctor. But what was clear to me, what was confusing to me is why I was doing it. And I became very clear in my why healthcare is a human right. And that's been my true north since that day. But saying it and doing it are two different things. But that led me and my friends to come to Chicago to train at Cook County Hospital. This was in the late 1970s. And it had every ideal characteristic that we could think about for a training ground, because County was at the crossroads of everything that was right and wrong about healthcare in America at the time, and that's the crossroads we wanted to be at. It had been discredited 2 years before by the Joint Commission. It was in the oldest public hospital building in the country. It had been built in 1914. In 1927, the American College of Surgeons said it should be torn down and replaced, something that didn't happen until 2012. But it was ideal for us because we wanted to be in that place. Oh, by the way, the house staff, the doctors, went out on strike 3 years before we got there on the longest strike by doctors in American history. And for things like interpreters, washcloths, towels, EKG machines. And the leaders of that strike, young physicians like we were put in Cook County Jail for defying a back to order. So this was ideal for us. This is the kind of place we wanted to train. Our professor says it's career suicide to go to Cook County. You'll never make it in medicine if you go to Cook County Hospital. But we went there anyway. When you walk into a place like Cook County Hospital and you care about health as a human right, it's everywhere around you. And I learned through my patients, many of whom are my patients today, what their living situation was like, what their lives were like, and that really redoubled my efforts as a doctor. But I also knew that we had to do more, because just walking in the door of a Cook County, you became part of the wallpaper, in a sense. And if you weren't part of change, how could you actually make care better? Things that were available across the street at a place like Rush were out of reach for us and our patients at that hospital. But this is easier said than done. So I volunteer, and I volunteer with the House Staff Association. And I remember we were having, I call this Doctors Within Borders, because we saw our patients during the day, and then in the afternoon we had picket signs. We went down to the county building to picket to keep the county hospital open because they were going to close it. And I remember signing up for one of these demonstrations, and I was on the press release as the person that the reporters needed to call. And I remember being on the floors at county, and my pager goes off, and it's an outside line, and I pick up the phone, and it's the Chicago Sun-Times reporter, and I said, "Hello, Dr. Ansell," and she starts talking, and I realize it's a reporter, and she asked me these questions, and I opened my mouth, and this is what came out. And I was so panicked, I hung the phone. And I realized at that moment that it was one thing to have this passion and ideas in your heart, but if you can't speak, what good are you? And like everything else, I realized at that point in time, the first step in speaking is allowing oneself to speak. And so I dedicated myself to speaking. I'm going to tell you something that happened when I was a resident there a few years later. So I got to the place where I could speak and I could get in front of a group of people and talk. And I could talk about patient stories and what was going on. But it turns out that patient stories and narrative is not enough. And I want to tell you a situation. We were in the emergency room at Cook County Hospital. In those days, there weren't attendings around, so the interns and the residents were down there. And the phone would ring in the emergency room. And it would ring, ring, ring. You'd go back and you pick it up and they say hello. And they say, this is University of Chicago Hospital, as an example. We'd like to transfer you a patient. I said, fine. Next to the phone was a clipboard with a pen tied to it. The pen had to be tied to the clipboard because otherwise it would run away. And on the clipboard were a series of boxes. There's a place for the name of the patient, the date of birth, and then there was a place for the diagnosis and the vital signs, and then there was a series of boxes that check reason for transfer. And what do you think the reason for transfer was almost 100% of the time at Cook County Hospital?
No insurance.
No insurance. And so we dutifully filled out those boxes that send the patient to county. But what happened in the 1980s was the rise of the uninsured. And the phone started ringing. It went from 100 times a month to 600 times a month. And a group of us got together. I was 24 or 25 years old and said, someone should do something about this. It's wrong. But we knew that just telling stories about patients being dumped weren't enough. And then that's when I came up with this new formulation about speech. Narrative, story, plus data, plus action equals change. And this is my first experience at it. We decided we would track 500 patients. This is actually why I ended up in academic medicine. I never thought of writing a paper. I never thought of doing research. This was my first research study. We said 500 patients we'll track, and we did that. It took 3 weeks. And we collected all those forms for the reason for transfer. And then we went and interviewed the patients and said, what did they tell you at the other hospital the reason for transfer was? And what do you think they said at the other hospital to these patients? No beds. And it confused me for many years. Why would they lie at the other hospital when they told us? And I realized we were playing a nice game of catchball. That was a nice person like me. They just happened to be at the private hospital. They were a young person. They went to church or synagogue. They went to medical school. They were raised with values. They were told by their administration, don't take an uninsured patient, send them to county. But they didn't have the heart to tell the patients the real reason. When we finished, as we started to do this study, there were rumblings around county. And a bunch of people were angry at us. This was a surprise to me. Why would they be angry at us? Because we're doing a study. And the reason is this is what county was for. County was to take the uninsured patients. And if we're doing a study that might disrupt its purpose, then they were afraid that something would happen to county hospital. When it came to the collecting the data, we found some startling piece of information. 25% of the patients were unstable, 25% ended up in the ICU, a portion of the patients died early. And I remember one particular patient very, very starkly, and I live in Oak Park, this is from West Suburban Hospital. A woman transferred to county, terminal stages of labor, 10 centimeters dilated, breech delivery, foot in the vagina, transfer to county for no insurance. And our OBs would tell us of women who died in the emergency room or died on the way to the emergency room, maternal mortality. because they had been transferred. So we finished this thing up, never done a study before, and we sent it into a journal. And then we asked the hospital if they would help us do a press conference. Now remember, we were young kids. And they said, no, we won't help you do a press conference. So we actually did our own press release, and we stood there in wavering voices with the press in front of us, reading. In the room next to us, the hospital did a counter press conference. But this was published. It was in the New England Journal of Medicine. It was on the front page of the Chicago Tribune, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. Probably the proudest thing that was said to us was by the county board president at the time, who called us a bunch of amateur sociologists. But I actually got invited to testify before Congress. And as a result of this work and other work, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act was passed, which made hospitals all around the country have to take care of people in emergency conditions. I said to myself, but I wanted to say a couple of lessons about speaking that I learned. So this was narrative plus data plus action equals change. But what about me? I spent many a night up anxious about the disapproval that I might get from my colleagues. People were angry at us. They held a counter press conference. Imagine that, a counter press conference. Our bosses denied some of the truth in our paper. One thing I learned is the following, is that actually, if you're going to be an agent for change, expect resistance. So not only is it our own ability to speak, but how we feel in front of our colleagues and the need to speak. And to expect when we speak the truth, there will be a reaction. I'm going to dial ahead 40 years, because I've been at this for 40 years, and now I'm semi-expert at this. So expect a reaction. I will say the other side to this other thing I've learned is the word no is a stepping stone on the path to yes. I'm going to end on this note. I mean, I could sort of talk to you about other things that happened. I'm going to talk something that happened last week. I was asked to be on a panel at Modern Healthcare. Rush is really taking a new look at the way we as an institution have responsibility and accountability for the conditions in the neighborhoods around us. And we've taken our mission to be a catalyst for wellness and health and economic vitality on the west side of Chicago by saying we have a special responsibility for the economic decline of these neighborhoods. A colleague of mine at another institution, an African-American woman who's in a position like me, posted a note on a personal Facebook page. And it was about police guarding schools. And she said, I hope they've been trained not to shoot black children. And she was suspended. She was made to apologize. And then the racists all came out and attacked her institution and attacked her. And at this conference, I was asked a question about how should we, in healthcare, address racism. And I said the following: as a white man who for many years felt uncomfortable saying the words racism or white supremacism, it's our obligation in our institutions to speak. Because if you don't get the root cause of why people are getting ill or dying early right, how can we fix it? Now, I said that deliberately. I said it openly. I honestly, in the same sentence, I said racism, no one dropped out of their chairs, white supremacism, and that we have to start at home in our own institutions by making sure around the table are those voices. Now, what I've learned many years ago is that if you believe in human rights work, you got to speak to it. And first you have to overcome your own censorship, the censorship of your friends who you want to think of you as being polite and not a boat rocker, the censorship of others around in your wider circles who don't want to hear uncomfortable things. But I've learned through these experiences many years ago that it's important to name things directly, say what you see. Don't tolerate things or we're promoting them. And if you're going to be a bear, be a grizzly, not a teddy bear. Thank you.